so that people don't panic.
That's really great. Thank you very much. And so you already,
Not panicking is always a good idea.
Right.
so, oh, we lost our Jim already. All right.
No, you haven't lost me.
Oh, okay.
All right, you give me my key and I'll meet you at home.
No, you're taking my car.
Okay.
We're gonna go figure out which.
Okay,
ones
well,
that
you can't sit in my back seat.
You have a front seat that works?
Yes,
So
I
there's
have a
two of them.
jacket too. Yeah,
Yeah, your jacket.
yeah, okay. Yeah, as you can tell, my boys are here. Give me a second. Thank you very much.
The rest of us don't have to wear masks though, right?
No, only in the, thank you very much. Have a good night. Only in the restaurant do I need to wear a mask.
Oh, really?
Luckily, we found a restaurant that had a television. So as we ate our sushi, we could also watch the football game. So
Oh, I see. So you've already met and got this all worked out?
we've met, and I think that everything is, hi, Lori. Hi, Miriam. I think everything is set. We're on YouTube. And I will look forward to looking at the YouTube when I can. So.
Okay, so we're on YouTube and this is being recorded then?
This is being recorded on YouTube, and then and if you wanted and I think sounds like the share, Daniel will be able to manage the share, so I think we're in good
Okay.
shape.
Oh, okay, great. Great.
Okay,
Yes, that's wonderful. Great. Thanks a lot.
all right, good. Have a great evening, and I will look forward to seeing this when it's not the middle of the Super Bowl and my kids are not
On your
bothering me.
back.
All right, talk to you soon.
Okay, very good. Very good. So we're starting to gather here. And
Hi.
you didn't have to travel in the snow or anything.
No,
Right,
easy trip
right.
from one room to another.
And Daniel, you didn't have to travel far.
I didn't even have to travel from one room to another. I just had to turn Zoom on.
It doesn't get better than that.
No.
Here we are, a lot of old friends are already appearing. And,
Okay, so Sherry, you are now the host.
okay.
All right.
Is there anything else I need to know or anything technology-wise?
I don't think so, but give me a call if you have any issues.
Okay.
All right.
Very
Sounds good. See you soon.
All right, good.
Rabbi Jim is the Lord of hosts.
Oh,
For the host of Lords.
that's that's who.
Sounds like a piece by Handel.
Does indeed.
Right. Did you tell Sarah and Neil that you were going to be doing this? Daniel?
They know. Yeah.
They know. Oh, okay, good. Because I wrote to them several times. I didn't hear back. And,
Nope.
it's through them that this whole thing has come about. And I was hoping they'll
Right.
have a
Hey,
chance.
Ruth.
Good. Oh, you know
You're
Ruth?
muted. I can't hear you, but I imagine
Hi,
you were saying hello.
Hey, Daniel.
Oh, nice.
I like
Ah.
the frames. Very sharp.
Thank you.
Here we go, more people.
These are the early birds.
And the Bengals ready to exploit it here.
Yeah, we're 1 minute early.
Gonna scan it quickly. He knew when he saw that three-man overload to his left side that it meant.
What's
Eric
going
Thomas
on?
was-
I don't know who that's coming from.
It sounds like football.
Super Bowl, definitely.
Yeah.
Someone's
Look at
listening
them.
secretly to the Super Bowl.
Maybe it's Mike's iPad.
I don't know. I think I'm listening to this.
We did have one meeting where actually we had these strange visitors that came and sort of dive bombed us. It was just
And it's good to
dreadful.
see TJ Uzama in the game.
I think we won't have that.
The
No,
MCL
I hope not.
on the outside, finally taking a break. But
Does somebody have the ball game on that we can?
You can mute everybody.
Yeah, we'll mute in a. I can mute everybody, but
Oh, for
hi,
Pete's sake.
Janet. I hope it-
Nobody has a speaking voice like
now we're okay.
Yes.
this.
Great. We're gonna have folks from Worship and Study Minion, and then we're gonna have some folks from our Mayock class from the Hebrew College and some of their friends. So we're gonna have a nice mixed group of people here.
Yeah.
Yeah, we introduced them and she asked him right on our porch.
Aha. There is the voice of Sarah, I could tell.
I'm so sorry. I thought I was muted.
No, that's fine. That's fine. I was gonna tell that story. of how
I'm
it
gonna
was
mute
all-
myself now. It's lovely to see everybody.
I'm so glad that you're here. And it's because of you that we had the honor of having Daniel Boyarin here. Because it was you who clued me in that he was living across the street.
That works for you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and we met on your.
I thought Aaron was giving me
porch.
a share the week after.
Correct.
Yeah.
I'm thrilled.
Okay.
And they
because
wanted to do something with
I
us
was
Saturday
confused
night
about
next week.
Moses, like, we'll have to be up at 5:30 a.m. Monday, that following week. I'm like, what?
I hate to mute everybody in the. right
Mute
now.
everybody.
All right, I will. Let's see if we can get everybody to mute here. I'm supposed to walk through this here, but I don't know.
Hi, Deanna. I meant to tell you, I don't know if you got the notice about Daniel Boyarin. He's going to be.
Adina, can you mute? Oh, here.
Oh, I thought you were muting everybody. Okay.
I'm gonna try. Okay, got it. But now we'll have to unmute yourselves, and particularly Daniel, of course, will unmute. Daniel, can you unmute? There you go. You're good. And let's see. I'll just give it a couple more minutes till everybody gets on. Because now it got so quiet. Just me and Daniel here. Okay, well, I think that we want to use every minute to the best of that we can. And Daniel, I think if you're ready, I think we ought to just plunge in and get started.
Okay, so I know a few of you, very few, but I'm glad to meet all of you, and always happy to talk to Jewish intellectuals. So here's what I want to talk about. I'm not going to read a formal paper. I could do that, but that always seems a little silly to me on Zoom anyway. And so I'm going to speak informally. I may hem and haw here and there, but hopefully it'll be a little more lively than just reading a paper. In a few minutes, I'm going to share my screen for a little text. Hopefully, if the screen sharing works, and I tested it, I think it does, we'll be able to read something together. But I want to introduce this first in a more general way before we actually look at the text. And what I want to say is that there are at least two ways of conceiving, theoretically, if you like, of the relationship of texts, that is, words spoken or words written, and meaning. What we usually, whether we think about it explicitly or not, we usually conceive of meaning as being somehow behind the words, behind the text, and embodied in the words. Right? That's the usual understanding of meaning, so that we understand interpretation of texts as an attempt to decode the text, as it were, and get back to its meaning. That, I would say, is the general mode of understanding meaning. It goes back at least to Plato, who explicitly articulates that idea of meaning and of interpretation. It is this kind of interpretation that gives rise both to the kind of interpretations that we generally in modernity engage in which we're trying in one fashion or another to get back and articulate the so-called original meaning of the text. It also, this theory of interpretation also goes back to allegorical interpretation, which was much more common or much more favored in antiquity and Middle Ages than it is now, in which we say essentially that the language of the text is meant to point to something other than what the words normally mean. The classic example of this might be the interpretation of the Song of Songs as not being about lovers, not being about sex, but being about either the relations of the Jewish people to God at the moment of revelation on Mount Sinai, for instance, or in Christian understanding, the relation of the soul to the Lord. Right? So this is kind of allegorical interpretation. Now, that kind of interpretation, that is both allegorical and the kind that we call literal interpretation, is characterized particularly by the sort of sentence, "This means this." And it matters less what the this that it means on this account, on this distinction, than the fact that I'm saying this means this. So I am substituting meaning for the words of the text, and I am claiming that the meaning that I am substituting is in some sense or other the true meaning of the text. Whether I'm giving an allegorical interpretation or what is called a literal interpretation, the essential claim, the essential argument of the sentence, "This means this," is that there is a meaning that is external behind the text, and it can be articulated in language in more than one way, right? That's what this means, this. What I'm saying is these words mean these words because they share the same meaning in the abstract sense, in the sense of the meaning that is before and behind the text. And you might be saying at some point or right now, well, what other possible accounts of meaning, or what other possible notion of reading texts could there be? And the other kind that I identify, certainly for the purposes of this particular talk that I'm sharing with you, is Midrash. Now, I imagine that many of you are familiar with Midrash, at least somewhat familiar with Midrash, had some taste or another of Midrash here and there. Midrash does not claim the text means this. It doesn't make that kind of a statement. That's not the underlying sentence that characterizes Midrash. Midrash operates by generating more text alongside of, interspersed with, around the text that we have, right? There's no meaning that is outside or behind. What there is the words on the paper. Let's stick with written text for the moment, for this. The words on the paper, and we can do all kinds of things. Let's say, to take the simplest example, if there's a story that we're reading, so midrashic interpretation might fill in more details in the story to enrich and expand and certainly articulate a sense of the story. But not by claiming that the words mean the additions or the articulations of the story that one is engaged in. Similarly, Midrash sometimes interprets the shapes of letters. That's perhaps the most extreme version of Midrash, or by extreme I simply mean the kind that it seems most strange to most of us, most unfamiliar to most of us, right? When a daled, which goes like this and then has a little spitz on the corner, is interpreted as being different from a resh, which has no spitz, right? And it is the spitz that is being interpreted as making the difference in meaning. So it's the physical letters, the physical words, and what we can add to them, not how we can translate them, that is crucial. Now, both of these methods of interpretation were characteristic of Jewish, or both of these methods of reading, I should say, because Midrash is really not interpretation, right? Both of these methods of reading Holy Scripture were characteristic of Jewish reading practices in antiquity. A reader such as Philo, for instance, Philo, Jewish teacher in Alexandria, in Egypt, at the very, very beginning of the first century. His method of reading is entirely allegorical, right? This word, this story about Abraham, for instance, is a story about the soul. In fact, most of the stories in the Torah, according to Philo, are somehow about the soul and the movements of the soul. So this means that. So he is absolutely Jewish, despite some Christian rumors that he converted to Christianity. He didn't. Although his works were much more read and passed down among Christians than among Jews, which is perhaps where that legend that he converted came from. Among other groups of Jews, other than Philo and Jews like him, the practice of midrash developed. Okay, so that's the first and major point that I want to make with you, is that both of these practices, both midrash and the kind of reading that is this means that, whether allegorical or not allegorical, are equally found, equally characteristic of ancient Jewish biblical reading. What happened at a certain point was that sometime around the 4th century, the Jews and the Christians finally decided that they were irreconcilably different. And it took till the 4th century, I believe, but that's my shtick. And went separate ways. At part of the going separate ways at that point, which is an oversimplification, but we'll stick with that oversimplification for today. By the way, I'm going to speak for about 15 more minutes and then open the floor for whatever kinds of participation you engage in. So at the time of that split, the allegorical method of interpretation was picked up by and continued primarily by Christian writers, and was characteristic for several hundred years of Christianity, or Christian interpretations of the Bible. The midrashic method became characteristic of the rabbis, and here the rabbis means the classical rabbis of the, let's say, 2nd to the 6th or 7th century, right? Not rabbis as Jewish professionals, but this particular group of teachers that we could also call in English the sages, right? The sages. And midrash was thus developed and was the characteristic form of Jewish biblical reading for that period of 400 years or so, but not exclusively so. So I'm going to now introduce, I hope, share a text with you, screen.
So can I interrupt with a question? Are you saying then that they saw midrash as an extension of the text rather than an interpretation? Would that be correct?
That would be correct. Yes, that would be very good. Mm-hmm. Okay. Can everyone see does everyone have the screen share?
Yeah, I think we're good.
Right? Great. Okay. Now, here are two very similar texts from the Babylonian Talmud. So similar that many scholars, including some of my antagonists, have said that they mean the same thing. And in the time that I have left, I'm going to try to show that they mean exact opposite things, and then make a somewhat perhaps surprising claim about them. So the first one I'm going to read is the one from the top one, of course, from Sanhedrin. Abaye said, now Abaye is a 4th century Babylonian rabbi of the Talmud, one of the most common speakers in the Talmud. He said, one verse may convey several meanings. The word in Hebrew for meanings here is te'amin. But a single meaning may not be deduced from different verses. Right? In other words, I can learn several laws from a single verse, but I cannot say the same law comes out of two different verses. Why? Because if a single meaning comes from different verses, that's a waste of language, right? If we could learn it from one verse, what do we need another verse for? And we're looking for some kind of parsimony in our reading practices. He goes on to say, so it was taught in the school of Rabbi Yishmael. And here's a verse from Jeremiah. For such is my word, like fire, says the Lord, and like a hammer shattering rock. Just as the hammer, and this is the gloss, the reading of that verse, just as the hammer splinters into several sparks, so one verse may convey several meanings. Right? The image, for such is my word, like fire, says the Lord, and like a hammer shattering rock. What does that mean? What is Jeremiah trying to say? He's saying that when you hit a hammer onto a rock, sparks of fire come out. That's how the fire and the shattering rock, the hammer beating the rock, are joined, and the hammer splinters into several sparks. Not that the hammer itself is broken, but that many sparks come out. So one verse may convey several meanings, right? This is almost the, how shall I say it, the locus classicus. This is the classic place from which the idea of Midrash as generating many meanings, many glosses on a single verse comes from this statement. Now let's have a look at a parallel. You'll see how close it is. Rabbi Yochanan said, Rabbi Yochanan is a first generation Palestinian Talmud rabbi. So was taught in the school of Rabbi Ishmael. Same thing. For such is my word, like fire, says the Lord, and like a hammer shattering rock. Just as the hammer splinters into several sparks, so one verse was delivered into 70 languages. Right? Now, most interpreters to this day have interpreted the second one, the second version, to mean the same thing as the first one. So they understand 70 languages as 70 different interpretations. Right? So if the first one says, just as the hammer splinters into several sparks, so one verse may convey several meanings. It could even be 70 meanings. Some manuscripts say 70 meanings to bring it even closer. And the other one says, so one verse was delivered in 70 languages. 70 languages is understood as 70 meanings. And Shalom Yisrael, they both mean the same thing. A former student of mine, Hazan Yadin, showed by comparing these texts to other parallel texts within rabbinic literature, that when they say 70 languages, they don't mean 70 different meanings. They mean 70 languages. French, German, English, Arabic, Russian, Slovak, Hungarian, Polish. how can a verse be delivered in 70 languages? Presumably, what it means is that the same meaning is conveyed in the 70 different human languages. And 70 here is a figure for all, means all human languages. So the statement of Rabbi Yochanan is, first of all, a statement that the Torah is available to everyone. Nobody is barred access to the Torah because the Torah, having been given in all the human languages, can be translated by us into all the human languages, and everyone has access to the Torah, with the same meaning being conveyed. So the theory of language that is being spoken, that is being articulated in this second version of it, is one of meaning being separate from the words of the text, and thus translatable into Hebrew, into Aramaic, into Arabic, into German, and essentially conveying the same sense in all those languages. Once we've seen that, we can see that Abaye's understanding of language in the first text is exactly different. He argues or suggests or claims that one verse may convey several different meanings, even contradictory meanings. That's probably most of you know that that's one of the characteristic things of Midrash, is that there are several different meanings given to the same language, the same Torah's language, and sometimes just by taking words out of context, sometimes taking letters out of context. There is, after all, a verse that says, addressing Moses, says to God says to Moses, you will lie down with your ancestors, i.e. die, and this nation will get up and rebel. But the Midrash interprets, or one of the ways that the Midrash interprets this, is by cutting it off, not where I cut it off, but one word later. In that case, it is read to mean, you will lie down with your ancestors and get up. We just leave off this nation and rebel, right? Because it is the language is what is revealed, not a meaning. So whatever we can do with the language to make it mean or to add meaning to it, we can do. So I hope that you see that these are two opposite understandings of language, that these two texts convey. They are not identical to each other. They are opposite. Now, initially, I, as a scholar, thought, remember I told you Rabbi Yochanan is a first generation Talmudic rabbi, and Abaye is a fourth generation Talmudic rabbi. So I initially thought, okay, Rabbi Yochanan's statement is the older one, and that was the original understanding of language, that the same meaning could be translated into 70 different languages, or into all the languages of the earth. And later on, they got the idea, this different idea, that the words of the Torah can be made to mean many, many different things. And the text, the Shabbat text, the one on the bottom, was then edited and made like the Sanhedrin text. And I even wrote an article about that. Well, I'm an old man now, so it's time for me to change my mind. I went back, looked carefully again, and as I was asked to speak on this topic recently, and I noticed that if you looked in the manuscripts, in both of these tractates, in Tractate Sanhedrin and Tractate Shabbat, if you look, the manuscripts have the opposite reading from the printed text, some of the manuscripts, not all of them. So effectively, we don't have two different texts that mean opposite things. We have two texts that contain that contradiction and that opposition within them when you look at the different old manuscripts, right? So to close the portion in which I'm talking with a bit of a rhetorical flourish, I would say that actually what is being enacted in these two texts is precisely the idea that language can mean many things, right? It could mean what Abaye said, it could mean what Rabbi Yochanan said, and we're not worried at the contradiction. And so it is these two texts put together which constitute the foundation of Midrash. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing now so that I can see your faces. And it's probably better, Sherry, are you willing to, recognize people if they have what to say and they raise their hands?
Yeah, sure, because I know the folks, most of them. And my husband here, Jim Leopard, of course, has the first, gets first dibs.
Oh, that's very kind of you, Sherry. No, I was just thinking when I heard about Rabbi Yochanan's interpretation, how what he's describing is the very opposite of what was described in the story of the Tower of Babel in Genesis, where the languages were confused in order to prevent people from being too haughty and bold in challenging heaven. And so actually what he's saying, if you think about it in terms of the Tower of Babel story, he's saying something remarkable. And that is the words of the Torah have this capacity to knit together the linguistic shards of all the different nations that were broken apart at that early stage. So I just wanted to throw that thought out.
Yeah, that's very lovely. It's very very powerfully a universalist message. Yes, but I like the idea of it being a kind of redemptive moment from the Tower of Babel to at the time of the giving of the Torah, as you said, a knitting together. Yeah, thanks.
Emily.
Okay, you happen to be talking about the fascinating subject for me, because recently I was reading the Tractate Megillah, where they talk about translation. I'm sure you're familiar with that. And one rabbi says that you can translate into any language, and another rabbi says that it's okay to translate things in Greek. And then I found some passage in a different tractate which said that the rabbis mourned on the day that the Torah was translated into Greek, because it was like making the golden calf. So there's a lot. I like what you said about all these contradictions existing simultaneously, but I don't know enough about this, but I thought I would, I've been thinking about that lately.
Yeah. That's very nice. Thanks. Yeah, it's not an accident that people say of Jews that if you have two Jews, there are three opinions. It's because for thousands of years, what we've been loving most is disagreeing, right? We tend to think of people as seeking agreement. The Babylonian Talmud, more than almost any other text, including almost any other Jewish text that I can think of, seeks disagreement, right? How many different ways can we see this? Sometimes it drives people crazy, because anytime Rabbi Meir says something, Rabbi Yehuda says the opposite. Rabbi Yehuda says something, Rabbi Meir says the opposite, right? So what is going on here? Actually, one of my students, former student of mine who teaches at the University of Buffalo, his name is Sergei Dolgopolsky, wrote a book called Talmud, The Art of Disagreement. So I think, Emily, is that it? I think, Emily, you're really onto something here. And even the disagreements about this disagreement are very much to the point.
Just suspend the law of non-contradiction and you're fine.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly it. No more Aristotle.
Okay, now here we have another fellow from our Mayotte class, Mark Beal.
Yes.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. There are I have two things. One sort of a point of interest. You went to other manuscripts. I'm just curious at the menagerie of manuscripts that are left that you would have to look at when they were written and things like that. That's somewhat academic thing. The other question I have has to do with making points, theological points, or taking different views. And for instance, if you look at Midrash Tanchuma, or if you look at the Midrash on Bereshit, so you look at those and you look like, wow, look what they're saying, and then you wonder how legitimate is it all, or is it just a bunch of people with their personalities and their viewpoints that they want to not inflict, but impress everybody with in some ways. So how do you reconcile all that difference of opinion? So there are two things.
Well, I'm not sure I understood the question about manuscripts. I mean, we have very fine collections of early Hebrew Aramaic manuscripts of the Talmud, as well as of other classical Jewish works from before the time of printing, for the most part. Some of them are better manuscripts, some of them are less good manuscripts. It is the work of philologists, that is, scholars of texts, to sort out and determine which are the more reliable and which are the less reliable on various criteria, linguistic criteria, etc. But what interests me here is not so much which one is right or which one is the most original, but the very fact that it's not only that it's not a disagreement between two texts, but a disagreement within each text, right? So that we can't even say Tractate Sanhedrin says this, Tractate Shabbat says this, right? So it was that further entangling that got me excited here, right? That it's a kind of enactment of disagreement that each one disagrees with, each text disagrees with itself, as it were, right? I hope that answers somewhat your first question. As to the second question, essentially that's what it is. It's a group of very learned Jews of a particular with a particular set of ideas, studying together for 300 or 400 years. I mean, you know, them and their kids and their grandkids and other people who came in, and producing this body of literature, which eventually persuaded most of the Jews, let's say from the 11th century on, that it was a worthy expression of what is called the oral Torah, and worth continuing to study. That's essentially what it is. So.
Okay, I see that Deanna Mercy has her hand raised. Deanna, speak to us. You have to unmute.
Thank you, Sherry. I just had a thought about back to the process of translation that we were talking about, and that the constant disagreement about translation and everything else. And I've been privileged to do some studying of the history of the Bible in English, and it strikes me that there was plenty of disagreement in that and other matters, but they didn't retain the disagreements. You know what I mean? They made a decision and put a lid on anything else. When King James came to the throne of England and decided that the Geneva Bible that was in general use didn't say nice things about kings, he commissioned a new translation, which was actually an amalgam of earlier ones for the most part. But basically, his interest was getting rid of all this stuff about kings that could foment rebellions, you know, and it was just suppressed. And it's my teacher, Avi Weinstein, spoke of studying with a bunch of people at Harvard Divinity School, of Christian ministers. And what they found amazing about the Talmud was precisely that here was a little bit of text and here was everyone's disagreements, and we retained them and kept studying them forever.
Yeah, no, that's I think that that account of King James is a little bit extreme. I mean, he had an interest in there being one Bible for the English-speaking world. I'm sure that his reasons of state also played some part, but as far as I know, it is not considered that was his whole purpose, was just to...
not his whole purpose, but it was important to him.
It may have been part, but his primary interest was, and this nonetheless supports what you're saying, was to get precisely a single text.
Yeah.
Right? A single text, and not to have different competing versions around. And yes, but that brings out my point that what became the dominant mode of Christian reading, perhaps almost the exclusive mode of Christian reading, was the idea that there is a single meaning behind the text that humans can, under the best circumstances, discover and transmit, right? That is, after all, the Catholic doctrine of the magisterium, right, as being the definitive interpreters for Catholics of the Bible. One of the indeed one of the one part of Luther's revolution, not revelation. One part of Luther's revolution was precisely to say that anybody ought to be able to pick up the Bible and interpret it for themselves, right? whereas, as you point out, the Talmudic tradition has always enshrined multiple interpretation. Yes. So, and it certainly goes to the question of translation also. Somebody just a minute ago, Emily, mentioned that there are some stories in the Talmud that say that on the day that the Torah was translated, there were earthquakes, or the world practically fell apart. Well, part of the reason for that is that translations tend to reduce the number of meanings, right? A translation tends to take an ambiguous text and make it less ambiguous, right? So that was the disturbance. That was the disturbance there. The way we know that the Torah potentially could be in any language is precisely through its translation into Greek, which, as we all know, was miraculous, right? It's called the translation of the 70, the Septuagint, because 70 different scholars were placed in 70 different rooms and given the Hebrew text, and they all came out with identical translations into Greek. Right, so that is a figure. I don't literally believe that story. Don't tell anybody, but it's a figure for the possibility of scripture being in other languages and having a legitimate authoritative life in other languages. And I think that's what King James was going after, but he was going after a single meaning also. Certainly did a lot for the English language with that translation, you know. Just as, you know, Luther created the modern German language through his translation.
Michal.
I'm hesitant to speak, but I'm going to anyway. This is so rich, what you're raising. I'm curious if where the idea is in all of this, that the words of the Torah are themselves, in themselves, something, that they cannot be reduced. Does this connect in some way to the way in which we return to it year after year after year? And each time that we come to these words that are like a well, a deep well that we can return to, or like a rock, or whatever the image is, that because they cannot themselves be reduced, they have a certain life in themselves, of themselves, as they are themselves, that we keep coming up with other meanings and other ways of seeing them. If I'm making any sense at all, if you could understand what I'm.
First of all, you're making perfectly good sense.
Okay.
My only question is why you were hesitant to say that. That's exactly to the point, right? And that is why within the Jewish tradition we read the same words every year, right? In most Christian liturgical traditions that I know of, there is a reading for each week, but it's not the same and continuous. They don't read the whole 5 books of Moses over a year. etc. And that's again because I think within these traditions, and I'm not judging, I'm not saying this is better or that's better, or I'm just trying to get some sort of a sense of a feel for difference. Within those traditions, it's the meaning that almost substitutes for the material text, right? And not the material text. You know, Paul of Tarsus said that when Christians read Moses, i.e. the 5 books of Moses, they see through the text as if the text is transparent. And what do they see on the other side of the text? They see the Christ. But Jews, he says, have a mask over their eyes, right? It's like Moses's mask, you know, that he supposedly wore when, and therefore all they can see is the text. And, you know, I have sort of a habit of, I find that frequently smart anti-Semites or anti-Jews get things about Jewish difference. That what we have to do is reverse the values of it and say, well, yes, Paul had something. We really do deify the text, not deify, but secularize the text itself, and the sparks that are set off when we confront the text, as Michal says, year after year after year after year. Whereas within the Pauline tradition, at any rate, it's precisely the fact that the text is replaced by something else, which is claimed to be its true meaning.
So in this case, if you believe the word is something in itself, then translation is a different thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly, and that's why Rabbi Yochanan says that the Torah could be translated into every language, but other rabbis, for instance, Abaye, who says that the Torah is like just gives off 7 meanings and more meanings and more meanings. The written form, how could you translate it? If you were to translate it, you would be closing off meaning. And that's why the idea of the earthquake that took place when the Torah was translated into Greek. We've got, within the Jewish tradition, within the classical Jewish tradition, we've got 2 very, very different perspectives. And the Talmud doesn't decide between them. It gives them both to us. As one of my aunts used to say, go no. Well, go figure sometimes.
Okay, I say we still have some hands. Ellen Messer, we haven't heard from you yet. You're unmuting.
Emily already talk?
Now we can hear you.
Okay. So thank you very much. I mean, I'm used to thinking of translation and meaning in terms of kind of the literal meaning, and then the meaning, the comparative Near East, ancient Near East meanings, and then the rabbinic and the sage meanings that always are considered, you know, trying to think about their historical context and what issues they're dealing with, and then meanings for our times. I mean, that's what I'm used to dealing with meaning. And I find it, so I have 2 questions. One is a very simple question. In Rabbi Yochanan's piece, when he says 70 languages, is he maybe having a veiled reference to the hypothetical 70 Greeks who did the translation? So each of them, in fact, you know, have their spark.
I wouldn't say that's impossible. And I would think about it more, but my immediate response would be that since, as my student discovered, the phrase 70 languages appears a few times within rabbinic literature and always seems to mean the languages of the earth, that that is the preferable interpretation, but I'm not rejecting or discarding what you're suggesting. I just want to think about it more.
Okay, because what I'm suggesting also then supports your point, which is that these are not contradictory.
Right.
Because in whatever vernacular the text appears, that provides the same seeds or sparks for reaching these almost unending possible meanings.
Yeah.
And so I'm thinking about that, and I guess I'm also wondering who sets the limits on what are the, is there a fence around just how far you can go in terms of thinking about the meanings and through midrash finding gaps that can be filled? Who sets those rules?
We do. The community of Israel, the sages. For example, exactly if someone wants to read the Torah and say it's about Jesus, we say no, that's not legitimate. I mean, it's legitimate in the sense that we tolerate human beings who disagree with us, but we don't accept that as a legitimate reading. Not as historians, as religious Jews. That would be a good example. If someone reads to suggest that the laws of the Torah are no longer valid, we can argue endlessly about a particular verse, exactly how to observe it or what exactly does it mean. But if somebody says, well, all the laws of the Torah are no longer valid, that is another example, a related example, perhaps, of what would be considered a priori beyond the pale. Beyond what pale?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Beyond the pale rabbis.
Yeah, because not dealing with hammers and splinters and splintered rock. I mean, I just yesterday and today I was looking at our Parsha de Teshuvah and just looking at the various interpretations of some of the colors. And I mean, it's very interesting the way you could call Christian midrash, which is also allegorical, goes off in the direction looking at the what comes down as the color scarlet or worm red, the tola'at shani, which scientifically we know comes from an insect that has this bloody red color, and then they take it in a direction. The Christians take it in a direction about the blood of Christ. I mean, so that's beyond the pale for us, but they're in fact they're using the same methods.
No, well, first of all, they're not using exactly the same methods, but that's irrelevant. I mean, precisely my point is to show that they're not using the same methods. That kind of allegorical reading becomes, at least historically, much more characteristic of Christian reading than of midrash. But that doesn't mean that doesn't. We've got to talk about legitimacy and legitimation in different ways, depending on what do I consider is intellectually legitimate, historically legitimate. Many things are, but what would I, as a what would I say in a synagogue, in a sermon, or represent as the Jewish truth of the Torah might be very different. than what I, as a historian, or even as just as a mensch, would allow. What you have your ways, we have our ways. But if you're asking me what are our ways have constraints, and those constraints are at the place where the whole system essentially would break down, right? So if we argue that the Messiah has already come, or if we argue that the Torah is no longer valid, then that would break the whole system apart, right? So it's possible to be tolerant, but at the same time, not accepting.
Okay, thank you.
Good. We're coming close to the end of our time. Emily, did you want to still ask another question? Is your hand still up?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
I can't resist this because I've been reading so much about this exact subject. This is real synchronicity for me. But I was reading an article which quoted Rabbi Nachman of Breslev, who was a Hasidic mystic, I guess you could say, and he talks about the holy language being the language of the 70 nations being idolatrous, being a desire for adultery, damaging the covenant and destroying the holy language. And I think that relates a little bit to what Michael was saying, that the holy language per se is very controversial, that you could translate it. Second short point is that I was comparing the Septuagint because I happen to have ancient Greek as one of my PhD languages, and it does not commensurate with the Hebrew in my estimation at all. So I could see how some rabbis would get angry at that. And I don't understand how the one in Megillah says it's okay to translate it into Greek. But these are the things that are driving me crazy lately. So this was very good for me, this talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Deanna, did you have something you wanted to add? Your hand is still up.
No,
or
I
you
was,
had it
oh,
raised
no, I
already?
didn't. It shouldn't still be up. I just wanted to say thank you, that's all.
Oh, yes. Can I ask a last question and then we'll close?
Yes.
Are you saying then that the rabbis of the Midrash didn't think that they were taking their interpretations straight from the Torah, that they knew that they were making extensions?
That's a great question. And I don't know. I wasn't there, and I don't have access to their minds. I have a certain amount of access to their practice. They certainly seem to be serious about what they're doing. The only reason to imagine that they might not be would be that it's so different from what we do. But that wouldn't be a very good criterion for, anthropologists sometimes look at people in other cultures who have very, very, very different ways of looking at the world and say, they must not really mean it. They're speaking metaphorically. And other anthropologists the kind that I like, look and say, wow, those people really see something that we have difficulty seeing or can't see. Let's see what we can learn from them and not how we can translate what they're saying into our ways of talking. Okay, so that might make a good.
This is a wonderful spot to end, and I just want to thank you so much. It's been wonderful and stimulating, and thank you all you folks who came out. And in particular, I want to thank Sarah Mail, who fixed us up. And what it was is that we were happened to be walking by their house, and she said, you know who's living across the street? Daniel Boyarin. And I said, Daniel Boyarin, he's a rock star. Well, she said, get him for Schmooze and Learn. And so I said, oh yeah, this is going to be great. And then another day we passed by, and who was standing there on the porch of their house but Daniel Boyarin? And then here we are today. So thanks to her, and Thank you so very much. This was terrific. Thank you.
Thanks to all of
So
you.
nice.
Be well. Good night.
Michelle Koach, thank you.
Thank
We'll
you.
seem to
Mr.
you.
Kower. Thank you, Sherry, for
Thank
organizing.
you, Daniel. Good to see you.
Good night, all. Thanks for coming.
Do we have a date for our next meeting?
Of the what?
Of the
Just,
Schmooze and
I'll
Learn?
send you an announcement. Yeah, I'll send you an announcement. Oh,
Thank you, Sherry.
sure, thanks.
Thank you.
Take
Great
care.
to see
Shavua
you.
tov.
Thank you all.
Thank
Very
you.
much. Good night.
Good night.
Shavua tov. Good night.